Pittsburgh for a couple of days, and it wasn't bad at all. We appreciate the opportunity to get over there and spend some time as a family. Although I think I've come back with a cold of some kind. Liam's at home with it tonight, not feeling well. So you know how it is. One person gets it, we'll all get it. But that ain't going to stop us tonight. Amen? Amen. All right, we're going to look at Luke 22, verses 1 through 13 this evening. Luke 22, verses 1 through 13, which is kind of a little bit of an odd text for us to look at, but I'd like for us to just kind of stop and think about something else as we're preparing for Christmas and we find ourselves in the Advent season. So what I'd like for us to do is let's read these verses, and then we'll go back and we'll kind of start walking through them verse by verse and unpacking them. And as we do so, I want to kind of point a big picture item for you that will hopefully encourage you today. So let's walk through the verses together. Luke chapter 22, beginning in verse 1. And the Word of God says, "Now the feast of unleavened bread drew near, which is called the Passover. And the chief priests and scribes were seeking how to put him to death, for they feared the people. Then Satan entered into Judas, called Iscariot, who was one of the number of the 12. He went away and conferred with the chief priests and officers how he might betray him to them. And they were glad and agreed to give him money. So he consented and sought an opportunity to betray him to them in the absence of a crowd. Then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. So Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, 'Go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat it.' They said to him, 'Where will you have us prepare it?' And he said to them, 'Behold, when you have entered the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him to the house that he enters, and tell the master of the house, the teacher says to you, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And he will show you a large upper room furnished. Prepare it there.' And they went and found it just as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover." The reason I want to walk through this tonight is I want us to look at a big picture. But in order to really kind of get to the big picture, what I want us to do is put some of the smaller pieces together. So let's go back to verse 1 and let's begin to walk through this. And I want you to notice as we walk through these verses that Luke is showing us the timing and how this has to work out. And so we see here that the Feast of Unleavened Bread is drawing near, which is called the Passover. And of course, a couple of things about the Passover are important. Obviously, this is a standing holiday. It is a sacred holiday prescribed by God to the Israelites in the Old Testament, that they are to keep this annually in remembrance of when the angel of death passed over the houses with the blood of the lamb applied to the door frames before the Exodus in Egypt. So that's where the phrase, the Passover, comes from. And so the concept of the Passover and Jesus being tied to the Passover is that those lambs that were slaughtered back in Egypt and the blood was applied to the door frames, those were kind of a foreshadowing. They did more than just protect the Israelites that night. But as they celebrated this and remembered this every year, they were pointing toward Jesus, the ultimate Passover lamb who would be slain and sacrificed, that his blood would be applied to us, that we might then be passed over in judgment. And so that's kind of the big picture here, that this Passover has been pointing toward this for generation after generation after generation after generation after generation after generation. It's about more than just them leaving Egypt and going to the Promised Land, but that was what we call a type, or kind of a precursor, a foreshadowing of Jesus to come. And there's many things like that in the Old Testament where you can see kind of a foreshadowing or a type of salvation, a type of Christ, a type of Savior in the Old Testament pointing toward the work of Jesus. David would be a type when he faces Goliath. It's not saying, that if you'll face your giants, you can overcome them like David did. That's not what David and Goliath is showing us. What that's showing us is that when we stand in faith, God can overcome insurmountable odds in our life. So don't go out looking for giants to try to kill with slingshots. That's not the point. The point is have faith in God, and he can overcome that. And so David is a type in that he is one. He is a singular person who is standing in the place of all of Israel in this epic battle against the giant, and God overcomes in the same way that Jesus is the one representing all of humanity who overcomes sin, overcomes Satan, and saves us through his work on the cross and through the resurrection. And so the Passover in the Old Testament was more than just we're leaving Egypt. It was we're leaving Egypt in this moment, but we ultimately need to be set free from the bondage of sin that holds us in the ultimate slavery. And no amount of lamb's blood can do that. Only the blood of the Lamb slain before the foundations of the earth can do that. And so it's very important that we tie together the concept of Passover and the work of Jesus, because this is the fulfilling of this promise and the longing of Israel for all of these generations, even going back to the time of Moses, going back to that first Passover. And so it's during the Passover when there were a few of these festivals that the men of Israel were required to show themselves at the temple. And so around Passover and around a couple of the other festivals, Jerusalem was just packed with people. So there's all kinds of people here from all over the region as they've come to celebrate the Passover in accordance with Jewish law and tradition. And during this time, the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to put him to death. And I want you to notice very explicitly the language that Luke uses here is it's not a question of if. Jesus must die. These scribes and these Pharisees, these chief priests, they've made up their mind. Jesus must die. Now the question is, how do we do it? Because they feared the people. Here comes Judas. Judas is going to give them the how, because they need to have access to Jesus at a time when there's not crowds around. And Jesus would go to a secluded place often, and he would take his disciples with him, his 12, and they would go together. And so Judas would know how to get to Jesus after the crowds were gone, and that's the role that Judas is going to play here. Is he's going to help these chief priests, these scribes, the Pharisees, Sadducees, all of them that are in cahoots together. He's going to help them to circumvent all of the people who have been with Jesus all day long, so that they can have access to him when he's what they would consider weak and vulnerable. He's not surrounded by the masses. You get to verse 3, and we look at these verses 3 through 6, and it kind of opens some theological conundrums for us. Like, why would Judas do this? Why? What would cause Judas, who has walked with Jesus for about 3 years at this point, who has known him intimately? And I mean, you can go back and look through the other Gospels. I think it's Matthew's Gospel, where Judas actually, even after Jesus at the Last Supper, he says, "It's not me, is it?" And Jesus says to Judas, "You've said so yourself." And so even at this moment, there's a lot of things going on. And so people wonder, well, what happened? Well, verse 3 here in Luke's Gospel says, "Then Satan entered into Judas called Iscariot, who was of the number of the 12. And so then that causes people to question, did Satan actually spiritually possess Judas at this time? And one of the things that I hold to is this is not really talking about demonic possession. And there's a couple of reasons that I hold to that. One is the language that's used. The word for entered here, it's it's not necessarily like a super spiritual word. It just means that this has happened. And so there are people who have tried to psychoanalyze Judas for as long as people have talked about Judas. Since the day this happened, people have tried to figure out why Judas did what he did. And there are people who will say that they'll say that it was because of the greed, because of the money that he could get from this. There are some people who say, well, he was disappointed that Jesus wasn't doing what he thought he should do, and he was disappointed in his role as a disciple, and he wasn't really doing all the things that he felt like he should be able to do as a disciple, and so he was bitter a little bit. There are some who believe that it was disappointment, but it was a different kind of disappointment. It was that he felt like it was unfulfilled, that Jesus was supposed to be the Messiah, and Judas in his mind was thinking the Messiah was supposed to be more of a Davidic figure that was supposed to usher in a time of Jewish military might, and that there was supposed to be this golden era rekindled of Israel, and they were going to push the Romans out, and Israel was going to rise to dominance again like it was the time of David and Solomon. There are some people who think it was a possession, that there was something that happened. And one of the other reasons, and I didn't mention this, one of the other reasons that I don't hold that it's possession is because in Matthew, after it all happens and Jesus is condemned to die, Judas goes and he tries to call it off. He says, I've made a mistake. And he takes the money back to them, and they say, we don't care, it's done now. And then he goes out and hangs himself. So scholars would say if he were truly possessed by Satan, he would not feel remorse for what he did, because he wouldn't care. He was possessed. So I feel like one of these other reasons is why Judas did it. But the bigger picture, right? Judas does this, and then he went away and conferred with the chief priests and officers how he might betray him to them, and they were glad, and they agreed to give him money, so he consented and sought an opportunity to betray him to them in the absence of a crowd. That's bad, right? Let's show of hands. Let's vote tonight. This was bad. Judas betraying Jesus is a bad thing, right? It's bad. It's bad. But it's not. How do I word this? I've got a phrase here. Not everything we define as bad is contrary to good. Let me explain what I mean with that. So, when I was in high school, I don't know if you guys have heard this story or not. Maybe you have. When I was in high school, I was a star of the tennis team at Livingston Academy. I was so good, I only played in like 2 matches my entire time playing tennis. They were afraid to injure me. I look like an athletic specimen, amen? And so it was coming up on my junior year for prom. I didn't have a girlfriend, and I was thinking about how am I going to go to prom, who do I want to go to prom with, and there was a girl that I was friends with on the tennis team, and we weren't dating. There was nothing like that to it. We were just good friends, and I asked her if she would like to go with me to prom as a friend, and she said, oh, that'd be great. Yeah, that'd be fun. And so we started making plans to go to prom together just as friends, you know. And like the week before prom, she gets a boyfriend who happens to be one of my good friends at the time. And so she comes to me and she's like, hey, he's asked me to go to prom with him. And since we're actually, kind of boyfriend, girlfriend, I feel like I should probably go with him. I'm like, that's fine. You guys go to prom. It'll be fine. I'll just go stag and hang out with some buddies. It'll not be a big deal at all. And she said, no. She said, I want to find somebody to go to prom with us. And we'll just all 4 go together. I'm like, whatever. I don't care. It's fine. And you could look at that in that moment. And you could say, "Oh, it's bad." That your first prom is, it's already not great because you don't have a girlfriend to go to prom with, and all this kind of stuff. And you could say, man, that's a bad thing. That's not a good thing that's happened there. Well, what ended up happening was they ended up getting this other girl to go to prom with us. And it's a girl I kind of knew. We had a class together, and we had talked a time or two, but really wasn't a whole lot to it. And so, we go through the whole spiel of, I rent my tux, and my buddy rents his tux, and the girls get their dresses, and of course, this girl who's going has like 2 days notice. So, ladies, how would you like that? 2 days notice, you're going to prom. Yeah, super easy to get your hair done, right? 2 days before prom, all kinds of openings. And so she's kind of scrambling, doing all that kind of stuff. So we get together, we pick up the girls, we pose for all the pictures, we do all the things, and we get to Livingston Academy, and, we open the door, and my buddy and the friend that I was going with, they left. And to my knowledge, I never saw them again. They just kind of vanished into the air. I don't know what happened to them after prom, but they just kind of. And so I'm standing there with this other girl, and it's just kind of the two of us, and we're like, "What do we do now?" So we ended up getting married. That's, what else do you do? That's my first date with Stephanie. It was just a God thing. That's the only way I can describe it. At the moment, it was kind of a bummer. It's kind of I had this plan, but now my plans all changed. And I think it worked out well for me. I'm pretty pleased with the way that worked out. So not everything that's bad is the opposite of good. And what we have to remember about Judas is that, yes, it is bad. Like in our culture, you don't betray a friend. In our culture, you don't snitch. In our culture, all of those things are negative. But the Bible had foreseen this and essentially promised it as long as we've been talking about the Passover. This had to happen. Just because it's bad doesn't mean it can't be used for good. And so then you go through this next section here. So you're thinking, okay, well, all right, so God has a plan all the way back here in the time of Moses when they're living in bondage in Egypt. God has a plan. Even as the Israelites are slaughtering the lambs and they're applying the blood to the door faces in Egypt where they're in bondage, even then God sees Jesus. He says there's a plan. There's a plan in place, and this is symbolic, and this is foreshadowing of what ultimately is going to happen. There's a plan, and he knows that the lamb has to be slain. He knows that the lamb has to be turned over. He knows that the lamb has to be beaten and ridiculed. He knows that the lamb has to be nailed to the tree. He knows that the lamb has to suffer and die. He knows that the lamb has to be laid into the tomb. He has to lay in the tomb before he can burst out of that tomb victorious. All of this has to happen. And so there's that plan from the Passover. Judas is going to play his part in the plan. And then you come down here and you see that the day of unleavened bread came. And the people are like, well, Jesus, how are we going to have this Passover feast? How are we going to do this? Because we don't even have a place to do this. And Jesus says, well, go and prepare a place for us. Well, how are we going to go and prepare a place for us, Jesus? That just doesn't make any sense. And Jesus tells them exactly what's going to happen. Because if God's been planning this thing since back here, and he's been promising this thing all the way up to here, do you think he doesn't have a reservation somewhere? God's got it figured out. So they go and they find exactly as it's supposed to be, and they prepare the Passover. And then that's usually where we start reading from when we do the Lord's Supper. And he came and reclined at the table. But what I wanted to show from this tonight, and I want to try to think of how I want to say this. God had a plan. God made a promise. And through the years of promise, I want you to think about all of the things that happened after they left Egypt on the Exodus. Right? Go back and read how ridiculous the Israelites were as they left Egypt, right? You've probably been on car rides with little kids, with toddlers, and you think, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? Because this kid keeps asking, are we there yet? Or the kid keeps throwing food all over the place. Or the kids, they look at each other, and the brother starts yelling at the sister, stop looking at me. And the sister pokes him in the eye, and then they start kicking at each other, and they start smacking each other, and they're throwing food at each other. And mom's trying to drive, and she's like, so help me if I have to stop this car. You know, for Pete's sake, when the Israelites they have been saved from bondage, and as they're making their way to the promised land, they start getting mad at Moses and fussing at God because the cucumbers in Egypt were just delicious, and they don't have any cucumbers out here in the desert. I'm not making that up. Go read it, guys. The whole time. And it gets to the point where, like mom threatens to stop the car and she's going to come around and spank the kids. Moses actually does that. He stops the Exodus and he smacks a rock. And God doesn't let him see the promised land because Moses loses his temper because the kids in the back seat just love those cucumbers so much. We've got that. We've got people complaining from the moment they left. Even before they're safe and away from Egypt, they're fussing because they come to the Red Sea and they don't see a way past it. And so they start fussing. Why did you bring us out here to die like this, Moses? And then you get into the actual history of Israel and you start talking about how they sinned, how they turned away from God, how they turned to the worship of Baal. You start talking about how they have become greedy and how they've become materialistic and how you go through the minor prophets, how they begin to take advantage of the poor among them and how they start taking advantage of the weak among them and how they start making all these rules so they can appear to follow God while really what they're doing is they're doing what they want to do and becoming their own God. And so God has to punish them. They straighten up. Then God has to punish them again. They straighten back up and then they fall back off, and God punished them. They straighten back up. All through history, they're doing all these things to the point that God has to allow them to be exiled, not once but twice, not just to Assyria, but to Babylon. God has to allow this to happen. God has to allow them to fall into the hands of the Philistines. God has to allow them to fall into the hands of the Romans here in this case. God has to allow them to go through war after war after war, has to go through rebellion after rebellion after rebellion. God has to allow them to go through all of these things. All of these things that Israel has done between God developing the plan, making the promise, and bringing it to fruition. And I want you to understand that God knows what he's doing, even to the point that on the night that Jesus is going to be betrayed, he says, there's a guy going to meet you right there, and we've got a reservation with him. If all of this can't thwart God's plan, you can't thwart God's plan. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to get everything right. You can mess up. You can make mistakes. But you can also trust God. What we see when we follow through this, what we see from Passover to Judas to the man who is going to show them the large upper room furnish where they're going to have this last Passover. The Passover that Jesus says that he has longed for this Passover since before he was even in the flesh. Jesus has longed for this Passover going all the way back to the time of Moses and saying there'll come one day when I will have Passover with my people and then I will set them free. Jesus has longed for this for so long. He's wanted this to happen. If Israel and all the mistakes they made couldn't mess up God's plans, you and I can't mess up God's plans. Now, there's a lot of sin along the way. There's a lot of rebellion and fussing, but God still overcame. What I want to kind of emphasize to you tonight as we kind of close on these verses is that precise thought. God is in control. And God will fulfill his promise. And you may feel like you're a mess up. You may feel like you make mistakes. And that's because you do. But no mistake you can make is bigger than God. So we can trust him. We can follow him and we can have faith in him. And we can rest in the truth that when God decrees something to happen, it will happen. I don't know about you guys, but I find a lot of encouragement in that. Because a lot of times, I talk about this a lot of times we feel like, or I feel like, I don't know if you guys feel like it, but a lot of times I feel like trying to determine what I should do in certain situations is kind of like walking a tightrope. And if I make one little mistake, I'm going to throw everything off. That's not how this works. We serve a God who can take bad and turn it good. He's bigger than our mistakes. He's bigger than our failures. And we can trust him. That encourages me. So on that note, I'd like for us to take a few moments to